Hi guys, I'm Murray Brilliant, and I'm here to talk to you about the genetics of albinism, or how albinism is inherited. So we should start off first with what albinism is, and it's an absence of melanin, which is pigment. And in this picture, you see skin cells, at the bottom of which is a melanocyte or pigment cell. Kind of looks like an octopus with its arms stretching into the skin. Inside the melanocyte or pigment cell, there are factories called melanosomes, and these factories make melanin pigment and that melanin pigment is distributed into the skin, and that's what gives us skin color. Now, how these melanosomes actually make melanin, that is controlled by genes in the nucleus of the cell, and those genes direct the production of melanin pigment. Now, genes are found in the nucleus, and they're inside chromosomes, or parts of chromosomes, which are very long stretches of DNA coded by proteins. But that DNA is made up of double helix, and then the letters of that DNA, there are 4 of them, and they're called nucleotides. And they form the alphabet of the genetic code. And the genetic code is responsible for all the proteins and all the directions on how to make a human being. So we human beings have 22 sets of chromosomes, 22 pairs of chromosomes, and they're shown here. We call those autosomes because autosomes are inherited as pairs, one of which comes from mom and the other comes from dad. So if we look at chromosome 1, which is the largest chromosome, we see there are 2 chromosome 1s in cells. One of those chromosomes came from mom, and the other chromosome came from dad. And that's true for all of the autosomes, that is chromosomes 1 through 22. There are other chromosomes called sex chromosomes. Those are the X and Y chromosomes. So females have 2 copies of the X chromosome, one of which they get from mom, the other X chromosome they get from dad. And boys have an X chromosome that comes from mom and a Y chromosome that comes from dad. So the genome is a lot of information. And that information is for about 23,000 different proteins, different genes, 23,000 different genes. And those genes also convey instructions on when and where they're turned on and that sort of thing. Now, these instructions, the genome, if we think about it as a set of books, because remember we have letters, which are the nucleotides, and that's in a string, just like words are. So if we think of the genome as a set of books, it's going to be a really, really big set of books. And there's just a whole lot of volumes here. In fact, there's so much information in the human genome. There are 3 billion bits of information in the human genome. That's all your genes and all the DNA, 3 billion bits of information. And those are those letters that I talked about. And if you recited each letter of your own genome, one every second, it would take you almost 100 years to read the whole genome. So let's think about what happens when a single letter changes. So, you know, the poem here, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. So we know that one, right? But if there's a change in this, for example, if that M in one of the Marys changes to a G, now we've got Gary instead of Mary, and that's a whole different set of information, right? So the same thing can happen in genomes. So one little bit of information change can make a big difference. And this is the way we look at it. These are the letters that are representative of the genome here. And if one of those letters changes, say from a C to a G here, that could make really a big difference in how you look, how your health is, all kinds of things like that. Most of the time, those changes, however, don't make any difference because there's a lot of DNA that we don't think has a whole lot of coding for a whole lot of important things. So we can change a number of these letters and not change the story. But sometimes that letter change will change the story. So when we think about albinism, we know that there are different kinds of albinism, and those different kinds of albinism are caused by changes in genes in the genome. So if we look at chromosome 11, for example, chromosome 11 has directions for a gene called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase is an enzyme that's important in making melanin. And so you have two copies of the tyrosinase gene, one you get from mom and one you get from dad. Similarly, on chromosome 15, there's something called the P gene. The P gene is associated with another form of albinism called OCA2. And when we don't make enough melanin, that can be caused by, for example, changes in tyrosinase or changes in this P gene that lead to OCA2. So how does that happen? I told you that we inherit one chromosome from of these pairs, one chromosome from mom and one from dad. If both chromosomes have a change that makes tyrosinase not work, if both chromosomes are like that, then the person who has both chromosomes, both chromosome 11, with a tyrosinase gene that doesn't work, that person will have OCA1 or type 1 oculocutaneous albinism. If, on the other hand, you only inherit one of those changes and you have another gene for tyrosinase that actually can make melanin, that person doesn't have albinism, but that person is said to be a carrier for the albinism trait. So it's interesting to know that carriers for albinism it's really not all that rare. About 1 in 150 people who don't have albinism are carriers for types of albinism, and almost none of them know it. So if parents are both carriers for the same type of albinism, they wouldn't have albinism, but they can have children with albinism. But that only happens if it's the same type of albinism. For example, if mom and dad both have changes, both are carriers for changes in tyrosinase, they can have a child with OCA1 or oculocutaneous albinism type 1 that's associated with tyrosinase not working, okay? But it's important to also know that most children from carrier parents don't have albinism, and I'll show you why that happens. So if we represent the carrier parents here with their chromosomes, then it could be any form of what we call recessive albinism, like OCA1 or OCA2. If both parents are carriers, they have melanin, they're pigmented, but one of their chromosomes can make, for example, tyrosinase, and the other chromosome cannot. And when they have children, they give one of those chromosomes, it could be one or the other, to their children. So in the case that's illustrated here, the child got the copy that can make an active tyrosinase from both dad and from mom. And this child does not have albinism and is not a carrier for albinism. On the other hand, if dad, for example, donates a chromosome that can make pigment, and mom donates the chromosome that cannot make pigment, then that child will be a carrier for albinism, but that child won't have albinism. And there's two different ways to do that. So that's illustrated by these two different carriers. Alternatively, if a child inherits both from mom and from dad a chromosome that contains a gene that can't make melanin, then that child will have albinism. And statistically, we see that on average, two carrier parents will have 25% of their offspring. Again, statistically, there's lots of variance in this, but statistically, they'll have 1/4 of their children, or 25%, will not have albinism and will not be carriers. Half of their children will not have albinism and will be carriers. And only 1/4 of their children, 25%, will have albinism. But this is an ideal family. So for example, if they only had 2 kids, and they were the first 2 shown here, none of the kids would have albinism. The parents wouldn't know that they're carriers, pretty much. The kids wouldn't know that one of them's a carrier and one's not. And so they would never even know about NOAA or even have the slightest inkling that they carry the albinism trait. Now, people who go to NOAA conferences, people who are associated with NOAA, are selected because one of their family members, at least, has albinism. And so we see a lot more albinism in the families that go to that belong to NOAA, for example. But there are an awful lot of families just like this that don't have kids with albinism, just by chance. So what that means is these carrier parents, 75% of their offspring, 3/4 of their offspring, that won't have albinism, and only 1 in 4 kids would have albinism, again, on average. Because as you know, you can flip a coin. This is like flipping a coin, right? You can flip a coin and get heads 3 times in a row. That's also possible. So this is an average over hundreds and hundreds of different cases. So what happens when a parent has albinism, one parent has albinism, and the other parent is a carrier for the same form of albinism? What we would expect there is about 50%, half of their offspring will be carriers, and half their offspring will have albinism. In the case where a person with albinism has children with a spouse who doesn't have albinism and isn't a carrier, all their children will be carriers and none of their children will have albinism. This is what we call a recessive trait. So what I'd like to leave you with is this important information that every one of us has changes in their DNA. Only identical twins are really exactly the same. And most of the time, we can't see these changes just by looking at people. However, if you have albinism, you have changes in genes that make it very hard to make melanin. These changes can be really small. They can be as small as 1 letter difference out of 3 billion letters. But again, really, really important, you are like everyone else in all other respects. You are not limited in what you can accomplish.
Hello, my name is Dr. Rick Thompson. I'm an optometrist from Toronto, Ontario, near Toronto, Ontario in Canada. And I'm very interested in people with albinism. In fact, I have a daughter who's a 26-year-old with albinism, and I see many patients in my practice with albinism. Okay, we're going to talk about albinism and vision. There are 2 main types of albinism. One is ocular albinism. That's where there's pigment in the hair and the skin, but there's a lack of pigment in the eye. That's called ocular albinism. Then there's oculocutaneous albinism, which is lack of pigment in the hair, eyes, and skin. And these are the people with very light blonde hair or very light skin and very light skin. But the most important thing to realize is vision difficulties are seen in all types of albinism. The amount of vision difficulty varies between people with albinism depending on the amount of pigment in their eyes. Now, here's a person with albinism, and we're going to show you the parts of the eye. This is the very front part. Can you name the parts? There's the pupil. There's the iris. The white part is called the sclera. We can see the eyelashes. They're dark. So this person looks like they've had some eyeliner and they've touched them up. There's white skin there. And what color are your eyes? People with albinism usually have violet or blue, green, and even brown eyes. The eyes are only red or pink in flash photos or if the light is shining directly in your eyes. And see this youngster, that's a bright light, and we can see their eyes are quite light, but normal room coloring, we don't see it look like that. Okay, now here's a cross section of the eye. I'm going to show you the parts. This is the very front part called the cornea. We have the iris, this dark part here. By the way, everything that's dark along here is where pigment is. And people who don't have albinism have that pigment, but people with albinism lack that pigment. There's a lens inside the eye. Then this part called the vitreous humor, that's really like a jelly inside the eye. And when we use our eyes for seeing, the light is focused at the very back. This is called the macula, and the very center part is called the fovea. But this is how we see. When we look at the very back of the eye, there's a picture of the fovea right there, and this is a normally pigmented eye. It's nice and orange. It's kind of interesting. We see some arteries in here, and there's some veins right here. And the person with albinism, there's some small arteries and there's some small vein. There's a vein there, but the back of the eye is more yellowish rather than orange. And this is what a doctor would see when they look at the back of a person who has albinism. In fact, the very center of the eye, called the fovea, in a person with albinism, it's back here. There's a lot fewer cones in that retina. This makes it hard to see detail. How do we measure how much detail we see? Well, we use an eye chart. There's an eye chart right here. There's a big E up here. If a person sees really well, that's called the 20/20 line, where above the red line here, that's 20/20. It looks like a fraction. This is 2200, and that's a much bigger letter. That's the minimum we can see. What is visual acuity? Those with albinism have trouble seeing those letters on that Snellen eye chart, even with their eyeglasses. Visual acuity is a fraction. The numerator, or the top part of the number, is 20, which is based on the 20-foot test distance. The denominator, which is the bottom part of that number, is a measure of vision. People with albinism have acuities ranging from 20/30 to 2400s. Do I need glasses? Eyeglasses are needed for farsightedness, astigmatism, or short-sightedness, which is also called myopia. Even babies could wear glasses. The eye doctor uses an instrument called a retinoscope to determine the right eyeglasses, or if they are even needed. Those with albinism will not have 20/20 vision, but eyeglasses may help them see better. Dilating drops help the eye doctors find the right prescription for those eyeglasses. Nystagmus. This word is also said nystagmus, but that's a pretty big word. What it really means is describes the rhythmic back and forth movement of the eyes, which appears when the baby is very young, even at 2 or 3 months of age. The nystagmus, that back and forth movement, affects the ability to see detail by only 1 or 2 rows of letters when looking at the eye chart. If you want to see your own nystagmus, someone can take a close-up video of your eyes, or you can do a selfie of your eyes and have a look at that video. Here's another big word, strabismus. This is an inward or an outward turn of the eye. If you see this little boy on the left here, that right eye is turning in, and this left eye is straight. That's called esotropia. There's another one, there's another child over here, that right eye is turning out. This left eye is straight. This is called exotropia. The eye is an outward turn. Bright light can be a problem. Difficulty seeing, this happens especially in bright light situations, especially sunlight, where the object is in your eyes. Bright light can be very uncomfortable. You can get sore eyes and headaches. That's no fun. Here's a picture of some bright lights. This is the bright sun of the one on the left. It's really hard to see those buildings because of that bright sunlight. And the one on the right here, there's somebody overlooking some water, and you can see that person, but you can't see the detail because of that glare. What can you do about this bright light? You can wear sunglasses, you can wear a visor or a hat, you can have tinted windows. We often see those tinted windows in cars and SUVs. And watching where you sit, having a bright light behind you as opposed to in front of you. Always keep that bright light behind you, and that will make it easier, a little easier to see. Color vision is usually normal with people with albinism. It's used to identify objects. One thing mom and dad can be conscious of wearing is a brightly colored shirt if you're in a busy place where there's a lot of people. It's also helping finding groceries. Look at all those cereal boxes. If we look at the words, it makes it a little harder. But if you look at the colors of the box, it'll be easier to recognize those objects. Now, how do vision problems affect those with albinism? People with albinism hold books very close to read. That can be even 3 to 6 inches, where most people will hold them at 12 to 16 inches. They might sit really close to the TV. It might be 2 or 3 feet. Where the rest of us are maybe sitting on the couch, which is 10 to 15 feet away. Sitting close to the computer monitor. People with albinism have trouble seeing that detail whenever they're looking at stuff. It might affect their ability to learn how to ride a bike. But it is possible to learn to ride a bike with albinism, and also learning to throw and catch a ball. And with practice, you can do better. How do other vision problems? It affects printing. And again, with practice, it gets better. Bumping into furniture or misjudging steps, especially if the sun's pretty bright. Recognizing faces across the room and in the crowd. Squinting when it's really bright out. But we do know people with albinism have a keen awareness of color. Some ways to help see better. Eyeglasses, as we can see that little girl in the bottom has glasses to see. We can wear sunglasses. That little boy with the sunglasses on the bottom not only has those sunglasses on, he has a wide brim hat. He could also wear a baseball cap. There's some ways to see better as well. We can use magnification, make things look bigger, make the print or picture bigger, move closer to the object, such as moving closer to that TV. And when I say about making the print bigger, we can see that with this device down here. That pebble magnifier makes that print bigger. And we can use telescopes. This little boy here has glasses on with what we call a bioptic. That magnifies things so he can see detail better in the long distance. Now, I told you quite a bit about albinism and the vision, and hopefully you learned something today. Maybe you can ask me some questions on the chat, or feel free to email me down below at rthompson@albinism.org.
The CARE project, Creating an Albinism Resource for Education, provides parents of school-aged children with albinism, educators, and other professionals with resources and information to assist them in formulating a child with albinism's education document. Education documents include Individual Family Service Plans, IFSPs, Individual Education Plans, IEPs, and/or 504 plans. You can access the CARE project database to review actual IFSPs, IEPs, and/or 504 plans for children with albinism for help on myriad topics such as grade level goals, assistive technology recommendations, orientation and mobility goals, age objectives, and social development objectives. For more information, visit www.albinism.org/care.